My own view is that mental health is an unfortunate phrase. I know what people mean by it, but I think it's a metaphor that's got out of control. There's physical. I don't think there's any such thing as physical health. All health is physical health, in my view. Mental health. What is mental health? The phrase mental health implies that there is a medical science, as it were, that is focused on the mind as an object of scientific inquiry, like a bone or a cancer or cancerous cell. If that's true, then the champions of mental health as a phrase, as a literal phrase, a non-metaphorical phrase, have solved one of the biggest problems in the history of philosophy, namely the mind-body problem. And the mind-body problem just is the problem of, is the mind an object, a scientific object? Is the mind the brain? Now, my view, and it's maybe not a popular view in contemporary philosophy, but certainly I'd say the overwhelming consensus of philosophers in the West has been that, that when we're talking about soul or mind or consciousness, we are talking about something that's real and not fully reducible to underlying neurophysiological states. Now, maybe that's right, maybe that's wrong. It's an open question. The phrase mental health closes that question. It says we've settled that question. We've settled the question of whether or not the mind is something that can be both explored by scientific means and solved and addressed, as it were, cured via scientific means. And I think there's a deep conceptual confusion, a category mistake embedded in that phrase, which leads to all kinds of dialogues of the deaf and policy confusion, because we start to then think of psychological suffering in terms that are the same as physical suffering. So we'll look at sort of, cancer rates and waiting lists, and then we'll look at rates and waiting lists for generalized anxiety disorder. GAD is one of these phrases a student explained to me the other day, which I think is just being a little bit anxious. So this is a deep problem, and it's one that I think disconnects us. Maybe this is accelerated by the digital revolution, but it disconnects us from and renders problematic, as it were, ordinary features of human experience. I asked a young person the other day to explain to me what was the phrase? I think it was social phobia. So what is social phobia? Well, it turned out that it was just anxiety. I've got GAD, one person said, generalized anxiety disorder. And I said, well, why do you think you've got GAD? He said, well, I don't know, I'm just feeling very stressed. And I pointed out that the student had very important exams in a few months' time. I said, do you think that's why you've got GAD? And she said, yes, probably, that's definitely, I'm worrying a lot about my exams. I said, well, not only is that normal, it's actually good. It's good to feel anxious about your exams, because you're going to do better, and it's a totally normal, non-pathological response to an ordinary human scenario. There was a study done a few years ago, a fascinating article by a group of psychologists trying to explore at what point grief becomes PTSD. And it's fascinating watching these experts trying to fix the appropriate limits on grief. So, they were trying to settle the question of, how long is it reasonable for you to feel grief over the death of a loved one? At which point does it just cease to be acceptable? At what point does grief turn into a pathology? Well, my view is there is no answer. You shouldn't even be looking for an answer to that question.
It's going to be different for everyone.
It's going to be different for everyone, and you're not going to be able to quantify it, and it's none of your business. Leave me alone with all your fancy acronyms. And once I've got PTSD, then if you start calling it PTSD, then I guarantee that I'll have that longer than my grief may have lasted had I not pathologized it.